Welcome to today's presentation. I'm Heather Hairston, President of the Baltimore City Historical Society. Thank you so much for joining us, and a big thank you to those who donated to be with us today and to this year's Doors Open Baltimore sponsors. The Baltimore City Historical Society is proud to present this evening's presentation with the Baltimore Architecture Foundation. The BCHS is dedicated to promoting the study, presentation, and appreciation of Baltimore City history. We are an all-volunteer organization that produces educational programs throughout the year, such as the Baltimore History Evenings. And we're grateful for today's partnership as a means of expanding our programming. You can learn more about our organization at baltimorecityhistoricalsociety.org. Next, I have a few announcements. I hope you can join us next week for the following virtual presentations. Tomorrow, join us for a presentation by architect Ward Bucher for a presentation on the work he and his wife, Lisa Johnson, are undertaking to restore the grand Hawley Hutzler mansion. On October 28th, we will be joined by William Canup for a presentation on the quirky postmodern designs of best product showrooms. Finally, on October 29th, Nicole King will present a history of Poppleton and the ongoing efforts to preserve this African-American neighborhood and fight displacement. Now I'd like to introduce this evening's moderator and fellow BCHS board member, Kristina Gaddy. Kristina is the author of Flowers in the Gutter, the true story of the teenagers who resisted the Nazis, published in 2020, and Well of Souls, Music, Dance, Spirituality, and the Early Banjo, forthcoming from W.W. Norton in 2022. Her journalism and essays have appeared in the Washington Post, Baltimore Sun, Baltimore Magazine, OZY, Narratively, Proximity, among others. She received her undergraduate degrees from UMBC in History and Modern Languages and her MFA in Nonfiction Writing from Goucher College. Welcome, Kristina.
Hey, welcome everyone. I'm joining from the porch of my Daylight Row house here in Better Waverly, Baltimore. I am definitely an unrepentant lover of history, so that makes me very pleased to facilitate the discussion of A History Lover's Guide to Baltimore by Brennan Jensen and Tom Chalkley. And if you haven't got your copy yet already, it's available at Atomic Books, where copies are signed, the Ivy, Red Emma's, lots of places here in town, as well as online retailers, if you are joining us from England, for example. And I'm so excited to welcome Brennan and Tom to chat, and they're going to share some photos. Brennan Jensen has been writing from and about Baltimore for over 30 years. He was a senior writer at Baltimore City Paper, RIP, I always have to add the RIP, where along with co-author Tom Chocoly and Charles Cohen, he penned the quirky history column Charmed Life, which was released in book form in 1999. He's also been a contributor to Urbanite Magazine, Baltimore Magazine, Johns Hopkins Magazine, National Public Radio, and the City Lab blog. And although he's been a Baltimorean since 1986, he has to admit that he was born in DC and is an occasional contributor to Washingtonian Magazine, but please don't hold that against him. We don't want to see any of that in the chat. Tom Chocoly is a Baltimore-based cartoonist and illustrator, and he's dabbled heavily, I would say very heavily, in journalism and random nonfiction. He came to Baltimore in 1979 to play rock and roll, and now lives in a leafy and uneventful corner of Northwest Baltimore. He also plays in a band called the Patapsco Delta Boys, along with Brennan's brother, Jonathan. As I said, I'm on my porch, so if some 12 o'clock boys are outside, I can't do anything about it, I apologize. Brennan and Tom are going to share some photos and stories of places in the book, and we'll have plenty of time at the end for a Q&A. If during the presentation you want to ask a question, you can put it in the chat, or you can also use the Q&A function. Because we're in webinar mode, we have both. And if you're more comfortable speaking your question rather than typing or writing it, please let me know by just raising your hand, and we'll get to it. So without further ado, Tom and Brennan.
Want to go into the slides or?
Okay.
Are we ready to slide? So
I'm hoping my dog back here behaves during the presentation, but she might bark if I get something wrong factually. She's pretty good on the 17th century, so I don't.
are we? Should I go ahead and share my screen now?
Yeah, go ahead and do that.
Okay.
All right.
All right. So right now I've got that, and now I got to go to this, and to that. All righty, and so here we go. How does that look, folks?
Looks great.
All righty.
All righty. So there's our book. Brennan, do you want to say just a few things about how the book's set up and so forth? And
Yeah, I mean, it's well, how do you, well, maybe we'll talk about in the Q&A, how do you approach the idea of presenting a history-focused tourist guide, but what we came up with is basically 12 chapters. Each one is based on a theme. Like obviously we start with the colonial era, and then we want military history. We talk about the great philanthropists. We have an African-American history section. And each one starts with sort of an essay, and then we go into sites that you can go visit. Some are attractions and museums, and some are just buildings you can stand out in front of and admire. So what we're doing, you're going to see now, we've been doing this thing a couple times around town. Is we called it History of Baltimore in 10 Buildings. We sort of adapted it for tonight. We think you're probably a little bit more knowledgeable than some of the folks we've been dealing with, and we want to have a little more fun with it. So I'm going to show some slides, talk a little bit about some of the stories that are in the book, and then hopefully generate some interest for the Q&A at the end. And of course, book sales makes a great gift. It fits right in a stocking. So, Tom, you want to?
As we're sliding into the slides here, Brennan pointed out we've divided the book in 12 chapters according to different themes. And basically what we've done with these slides is tried to pick iconic structures, locations that is emblematic of one of the sections in the book. But the reality is that there's only so many ways you can slice and dice history. There are infinite numbers of ways you can slice and dice history. And this is basically, we slotted buildings in kind of according to what we wanted to say about them. If something was an outstanding piece of ecclesiastical architecture, it shows up in the section on religion, for example. So anyway, I guess we can proceed with some slides. Let me proceed with a slide, and then we'll start talking. There we go. Brennan.
Okay. Naturally, we got to start here. This is booming metropolis of Baltimore in 1752. Baltimore is kind of a newcomer among the East Coast cities. Most of them started at least a century earlier than we did. And we don't have a lot of colonial stuff left. I mean, there's none of the buildings depicted in this image are still with us. What is interesting is the church there at the top in the middle, the highest point in the town. Of the original 60 lots, that is the only one that's still in the original hands. That's the Episcopal Church. That's where old St. Paul's stands today. But the church we see downtown now was built in 1854. So in the book, we have a chapter, talking about the colonial era and some of the what things that are there to see from that era, like Mount Clair and then some of the buildings in Fells Point. But for this talk, I wanted to go discuss one of my favorite buildings in town. Tom, if you want to.
Oh, pressing the wrong button. Sorry.
There we go. This is when I first started the book, this was the first place I went to because I'd never been there and I'd heard it was really cool. This was back in 2019 before the pandemic, and it really is a fascinating place. This is Davidge Hall, University of Maryland Medical School, built in 1812. So definitely not a colonial era structure, but early enough. And we don't have so many buildings to look at that are that old. So I chose this one. The most fascinating thing about this is not so much the architecture, which is pretty cool, but the stories that happened within the structure. It dates back to a time when using cadavers for anatomical study was both new and very controversial. It was considered sacrilegious by some people to cut into a body. And someone told me to compare it today would be like the divide that we have around the topic of abortion. Now, this is the Anatomical Hall. I don't know when this photo was dated. It's not contemporary, because if you've been down there, and I think they've had some doors open down in this building, it doesn't quite look like this right now. The dome's got some water damage. It was actually damaged a little bit during one of those weird earthquakes we've had. And earthquakes are not friends to big masonry buildings like this. But I just talked to them today, or emailed, and they are, second phase of restoration starts sometime next year, but the building should reopen for visits in January and then close again once they get the money to actually work on the dome. But like I can say, the cadaver aspects, so it's the most interesting thing. And maybe I'll just read a section from the book. If you go to the next slide. I hope this doesn't put anyone off their dinner later, but this is Hermie. This is actually a desiccated cadaver they have down there on display. And they told me it really is a cadaver, and Hermie will be back as part of the exhibitions down there when they finish the restoration. But like I say in the book here, human dissection was an increasingly important component of medical education, but very controversial, as I said before. Of course, it didn't help that grave robbing was how many of these cadavers were brought to the school. Now, the building's namesake, Dr. John Beale Davidge, who would become the medical school's first dean, he'd erected a private anatomical theater of his own in 1807, and it was actually attacked and destroyed by a cadaver riot. So when they built Davidge Hall, they designed it to be more like a fort, and the actual the dissection area has like a little readout where they can escape and get out the back doors. But, well, I never had any cadaver rides down there, but they did have a case of burking, which is a strange thing. I wrote about this for City Paper. To burk someone is to murder them with the express purpose of selling their body to medical schools. It was named after a William Burke, as a Scotsman who did this particular practice in Edinburgh in 1828. So in 1886, a medical school custodian named William Perry convinced two lowly accomplices to stab and bludgeon a destitute Baltimore woman to death, and they presented the corpse at Davidge Hall's door. Now the instructors, they purchased her for $15, which probably would have been a good chunk of change back then, but they quickly grew suspicious that the body's wounds were so fresh. They alerted the police, and ultimately the foul trio were caught, but only one of them was actually hanged for the crime. Like I say, Davidge Hall hopefully will be back open again in January, and then it'll be fixing the dome for the next 200 years, hopefully. All right, Tom.
Okay, so one of our chapters, chapter 3, is about military history in Baltimore. And so I felt compelled to show you a picture of Fort McHenry, which is the most famous structure in Baltimore. But we have a very sophisticated audience here tonight, and probably they could lecture us 3 times around about Fort McHenry. So there it is. There's Fort McHenry. What I'd rather talk about is Fort Carroll, because Fort Carroll is more obscure. In fact, it's so obscure that this is I unintentionally cheated in including it in the book, because it's about a block outside the city line in the middle of the Patapsco River. When you drive over Key Bridge, if you're going from the Wagner's Point side to the Dundalk side, you can just look over the edge, and there it is, this strange hexagonal ruin with its little ramshackle lighthouse. Here's a nice view of it. I don't know how they got this picture, drone maybe. But anyway, that's a 6-sided ruin. It never got finished. It's a complete white elephant there in the middle of the harbor. It was built originally, 1848 is the date they put on it, but it was never really finished because they'd gotten only so far in the whole thing. They realized it was sinking. It was sinking because the muck was deeper and the building was heavier than they'd figured on. And so they had this elaborate, what they call a grillage or grillage of timbers and piers and so forth. No avail, it was sinking. So they stopped building it. And as it turned out, Fort Carroll never saw military action. It was built in 1848. To ward off another invasion by sea. You're always fighting the last war, that another invasion up the harbor. So the closest thing that I've found that it ever served to do was in the 1890s in the Spanish-American War. They said, "What the hell? Let's put some cannon on Fort Carroll." They probably had extra cannon and maybe some extra people on hand to do the work. I don't know. but you can see the proximity to Key Bridge here. You can see how overgrown it is. And let me go back to that last one. If you look in the foreground here along the wall, you can see that this island is mostly inhabited by cormorants and other seabirds, those little black penguin-like creatures along the edge. Those are the main inhabitants, and I'm told there are rats. But here's the deal, you're not supposed to go on it. It's in private hands. I think it's been in private hands since the 60s. So any photograph you see from the island was taken probably by somebody who was trespassing. Just want to warn you about this image. But this is a great Baltimore interior, which you have to trespass to see. And I'm told there's great masonry. And there's a big sign that says guard dogs. And I don't think they wouldn't leave a guard dog out there all by himself. So there might be hazards of bird and rat-borne disease, however, I would point that out. All righty, we're going to see another interior now, Mr. Jensen.
Yes. Well, this is a slightly different interior. I don't think there were any rats in the Peabody Library, and from a place that, you know, probably no one's been able to get to a place where I think most people have hopefully have been to, maybe been to a wedding there. It's a very popular wedding venue. When I first got the book assignment, the one thing I knew was I was going to have this on the front cover, and there it is. I think it's just an amazing space. And despite its popularity, I still meet people and they see an image of it and they go, oh, that's in Baltimore. And they're just not familiar with it. So I had to put it in there. It's a beautiful example of cast iron architecture. It looks like carved stone, but that's all cast iron work. Of course, Baltimore was famous for its cast iron architecture, mostly on the facades of buildings and merchant buildings, but this obviously another way it can be used. It was built by, you know, George Peabody. We have a whole chapter dedicated to the big philanthropist that left a mark. Like most of them, he was not from Maryland. He was born in Danvers, Massachusetts, which renamed itself Peabody in honor of him. Came a poor man growing up, didn't get a whole lot of education. I think at age 16, he had moved to Washington, D.C. to work at an uncle's dry goods store. While he was there, he just happened to serve as an artilleryman in the War of 1812. He came to Baltimore, and I think he was around 19, and had a little bit of success. In the 20 years that he was here, he grew his dry good business into this multi-state success story, and then he moved into finance. While he was here, he lived in this house. It's called the Henry Fight House. Don't look for it. It burned down in 1904 fire. But the interesting thing about this, perhaps some of you know this, this was the de facto nation's capital in 1776. Under the threat of a British invasion, the Continental Congress moved here for 2 months to hold their seat of government. And then Peabody later used it at his base. Like I say, it burned in 1904. I like to say the building that was erected over the site is the Civic Center, and it had its own British invasion when a certain George Paul, Ringo, I'm forgetting. The Beatles were there in 1964. So there is a marker in Civic Center that marks this building. I believe last time I was down at the Civic Center. But let's see, what's the next slide there, Tom? Okay, yeah, he went to London, made a fortune there in finance. While he was there, he helped save the state of Maryland's bacon at least once when the state almost went bankrupt. He was a bachelor. He started to give away his money, but wasn't going to wait till he died. Actually, London got the most. They set up a housing trust for poor Londoners, which is still in operation. But Baltimore got the money to build this, the Peabody Institute. Now we think of it as a music conservatory. Back in the day, it was that, plus it had art galleries and lecture halls. He actually came across the pond, as it were, for the ribbon cutting of the building, which was delayed because of the Civil War. Let's see what's the next image. Speaking of London, I have friends in London right now, and they're posting their pictures on Facebook, and I'm giving advice of which pubs to go to. I should probably go tell them they wanted to see, if they get homesick for Baltimore, they can visit this statue. The one on the right is in London. I think it's near the Bank of England. And the one on the left, which is a copy of the one on the right, is the one that we see down in Mount Vernon today across from the Peabody Institute. Tom?
Okay, we have a section about religious structures. And for the visitor, for somebody who's wants to go pry into history, the most welcoming of all these religious institutions is the Jewish Museum of Maryland over on Lloyd Street, adjacent to where it used to be a huge congregation, a huge community of Jewish immigrants and established Jewish families. This is an interesting museum because it's actually composed of 3 buildings. The one in the foreground here, the Grecian Temple, is the Lloyd Street Synagogue. It's the 3rd oldest synagogue in the United States, certainly the oldest in Maryland. It's built in 1845 when the fashion for all kinds of buildings was to go Grecian, to go into the pale classical mode, which was kind of seen as a little more upscale than the plain old brick. Most of Baltimore is built out of plain old brick and, with add-ons of marble, but then they went full Grecian when Baltimore was probably at its most highfalutin prior to the Civil War. So this is the Lloyd Street Synagogue, pretty straightforward rectangular space in back of that facade, and a very kind of a grim look to it. The other end of the block, which you see in the background, this is the Binay Israel congregation now. It was originally the Hizak Amuna temple, and it was built in 1876, and you can see it's a lot more exuberant looking. It's got that bright red brick. It's got motifs that are, I don't know if I have a cursor, I don't know if I have a pointer, too bad. There's a big round motif in the top center of the building that has sort of a almost medieval, possibly mid-Eastern overtone to it. The like pointed Gothic windows, that not overly fussy front. It's got some nice bare areas setting off all these windows. Beautiful, and it was done by a guy who was a stone carver, stone mason by trade. I think his name was Henry Burge or Burge. His son and grandson became rather well-known sculptors, but this is his most visible work. And then the central building is the modern museum, which I'm not sure the dates on this. I think it might have gone up in the 80s. But whoever did the architecture took care to try to make it consonant with the old Binay Israel building in the background. They're kind of cousins architecturally. That's a nice thing to see when the new likes to relate to the old like that. And then lastly, just a step inside, if you've never been to the Jewish Museum of Maryland, it's always worth a visit. They do great exhibits of all aspects of Jewish life in Baltimore. And they have this is their standing exhibit, Voices of Lombard Street, which is an examination of day-to-day life and institutions in old Jewish Baltimore as it was in the latter end of the 19th century and the front half of the 20th century, that you had this vibrant Jewish community down there. Not a whole lot left other than Atman's Deli nowadays in terms of Jewish institutions. Brennan, back to you.
Okay, well, this is a temple of another sort. This is a temple of beer. This building in East Baltimore, we generally refer to it as the American Brewery Building that's a beer maker that occupied it after Prohibition, but it's actually built by Henry Wiesner. John Frederick Wiesner, I'm sorry, Henry was his son. Erected in 1887. It was a centerpiece for his sprawling Wiesner Brewery, which is seen here in those lovely etchings they do that make even a factory building look, even the smoke, it looks so romantic and all. Most of that, a lot of that's been torn down, but there's the old row house across from the main, what they call the Bavarian Pagoda. That was the Wiesner's house. And they had extra rooms in there because they brought Germans over to work in the brewery. I guess they had some kind of expertise. I think part of the reason we bring this up in the book, and not only this beautiful building, which is also on the cover of the book, just to underscore how important Germans are to Baltimore. I mean, you think of Boston as being an Irish city, you have to think of Baltimore as being a German one. In fact, in the 1890 census, roughly a quarter of city residents were German extraction. And I think you hear a lot of people complaining about how immigrants, they don't learn the language, they don't learn English right away. Well, back in the day, if you were walking around the streets of Baltimore, you would have heard a lot of German. In fact, there were so many Germans, the public schools were conducted in German. probably the centerpiece of what's left of the German community now is Zion's Lutheran Church, and they still conduct a service in German each day, each Sunday. I know it mostly for the sour beef dinners they have down there, which if you haven't been, are really quite tasty. Let's see, what's the next image, Tom? We got okay, this is the building during Prohibition, the noble experiment, if you will. You can see it's called the American Malt Company because what they were doing, and a lot of breweries did, they were making malt extract. And what you can do with that, wink, wink, is you take it home and you add some yeast and some water and you make your own beer. I'm coming to you from Woodbury, and just up the road was the Melville Rye Distillery, and they switched to vinegar. It's on what is it, 83, and anyway, they still make vinegar today. So they used to make rye whiskey, delicious. They switched to vinegar in Prohibition. They never looked back. So all these places had to switch up, and turning into a malt product was one of the ways that they could get through the Prohibition. Let's see what's next. Then the American Brewery took over. That's what the beer they produce. It's probably not as big as the national products, but still you see a lot of signage and stuff around town. I have some of these glassware and so forth. It's a pretty popular brand up until 1973, when the likes of Budweiser and Miller and all the rest pretty much drubbed out all of our local beer making. And then the place went vacant and it looked like this. I got to go in here when it looked like this, and it was quite scary. You can imagine bats flying out of it. There was still a bunch of grain on the floor when I was in there, and there was a great wooden staircase going up the middle, and it was half burned out. And I had the good sense not to go up there because I probably wouldn't be speaking to you if I had been so foolish. But the good news is, there's good news to this. A social service charity called Humanum from Columbia moved in, renovated the building, and then I used it for, they do a lot of workforce development. This looks like probably a class of med techs graduating. The building inside is gorgeous. In fact, they even considered having our wedding there at one point. They maintained a lot of the old equipment. This looks like an old wort brewer, or it could be a lagering tank. It's now a de facto cubicle. You can imagine being in there, you get a phone call, no one would hear you or anything. I'm sure it's been open door before, but if it's worth a look, next time there's an opportunity to get inside this building. One final little monument to the Wiesner family. This is in Loudon Park Cemetery, with Mencken's there, but this structure dominates. It may be the tallest cemetery artwork in the city. I think maybe on the Washington Monument's taller. But this tells you how much influence and money that those old brewers had before Prohibition changed everything for them. Tom?
Alrighty. So this is a row house, and we all know how many Baltimoreans live in row houses. And we talk about row houses at one point. This is not the row house section here, but we talk about row houses in a kind of a grab bag chapter where we talk about the built environment. And there you'll learn about the history of row houses a little bit. This in particular is what we call an Italianate row house. And the main feature you can identify that calls it an Italianate row house is that fancy cornice along the top. Take that away and it doesn't look too different from like an old style federal row house, but there's a really nice modeling detailing on the porch here, on the front doorway, etc. It's a nice upper middle class post-Civil War house. Most of the row houses built between 1860 and 1912 probably were kind of like this. Okay. So why this house in particular? 1320 Utah Street it's a beautiful place, kind of serial curving stairways like that. Nice architectural touches, not a shabby place. It was the home of one of the most remarkable women who ever lived in Baltimore. This is Lily Carroll Jackson. Don't know how many people recognize that name, but she is undersung. She was not unsung, but undersung. This woman was for 35 years the president of the Baltimore NAACP, the National Association of Colored People. We discuss her in our section on African-American history in Baltimore, which is a huge topic really. And I don't think there's one single book that capsulizes that whole saga. But this lady figures very largely in it. You always see her from this side of her face because she had a palsy on the other side of her face. It happened when she was a young woman. So she had no muscular control and her face just sagged. So we always see her from the left side. She was a kind of a behind the scenes power, but not a shrinking violet. She purportedly learned how to face the public as a choir singer, but got activated when her daughters faced discrimination. And that put her on the warpath. She and her daughter, Juanita Jackson, later Juanita Jackson Mitchell, started to organize for civil rights in Baltimore. Nonviolent street protests, boycotts, picket lines, and this was in the 1930s. Martin Luther King was in short pants when some of these events were taking place. Most notably, most famously, here's an anti-lynching, this is a national issue that they're protesting here, but the most famous protest was a very successful "Don't Buy Where You Can't Work" campaign, which was to encourage, motivate Black consumers not to shop at stores where Black people were not hired to work. She laid the groundwork in many ways for the civil rights movement of the 60s. And then we're going to go to another row house, Brennan.
Yes, another Italianate row house, but a very different occupant. This is H.L. Mencken's house. It's a bit of a success story as small museums go, because it reopened actually just before COVID. I believe they got a Mencken fan point up like $1 million to do the renovations. It's been closed for a long time. I remember writing about its closure and a lot of the artifacts scattered around. It got caught up in the whole City Life Museum kerfuffle of some years ago, but it's back open again. Let's see, what's the next image? Well, he lived in that house all of his life, but this is a picture of young Henry. He's on the right there. This is at his family summer house in Mount Washington. I'd like to talk about this because people think like, why would you summer in Mount Washington? That's barely out of the city. In fact, now, of course, it is now the city. But you have to remember that the city in the summer in the 19th century really stunk. I think Mencken said Baltimore in summer smelled like 1 billion polecats. You didn't have sewers. You had horse manure in the streets. You had factories pumping stuff into the air. I'm sure that the harbor was totally fetid. So families like the Menckens would just go out to these summer houses where his father could still continue to commute to the cigar factory. And the kids were, the prevailing winds spared them from the indignities of the putrid smells of their hometown, as it were. This is a picture I took when I got a tour of the museum, wearing a mask and all social distancing. But a lot of these artifacts are, they told me, actually Mencken's items. I think the pillow in the back, if you look at it, says, "Why worry when you can pray?" It must clearly be kind of a little ironic joke for Mencken, the great outspoken atheist. I like how the chair here, you can see like his cheek prints were in there. He was kind of a big bone German man. He liked his beer and sausage. So, but that little humble typewriter is, of course, where he eviscerated the bourgeoisie, and the Scopes monkey trial was one of his most famous national coverages. See what's next. Here he is with a classic 1920s plastered down hair. This is in the house. That's a relative of his, an ancestor. A lot of the pieces are back in the museum. So when you go there, you'll see like the rugs, and there's a sofa that Fitzgerald apparently used to crash on when he'd have too many drinks, which apparently was not uncommon. In our chapter on writers, we talk about Fitzgerald and Mencken connection there. He was the first to publish Fitzgerald. And Mencken also was a claim to fame as birthing hard-boiled detective fiction. When he tried to raise money for his highbrow magazines, he published the Black Mask magazine to let these writers do the stuff that actually sold, and probably more widely read now. Let's see what's next. I have to include this one as this is, of course, Mencken celebrating the end of Prohibition at the old Rendered Hotel, long demolished, but once famous for its terrapins, which they kept live in the basement. Mencken was probably one that was getting that malt syrup from the American brewery, or maybe had some other German connection, because he certainly kept drinking and cigar smoking through that dark period. Let's see what's next. Well, okay, you can't talk about Mencken and all the wonderful witty writings and stuff that still gets memed today without discussing the sort of enigma that amongst the millions of words he wrote, he had some racist comments and some anti-Semitic ones. It's always been kind of curious because he did so much to help Black writers, W.E.B. Du Bois being one that he published. He often wrote about the folly of segregation. In fact, his last piece in the Sun was about how stupid it was that these Black and white kids trying to play tennis at segregated courts in Druid Hill Park were arrested. But nevertheless, he did say these things, so it's part of his record. And I think it kind of, he could have been a Mark Twain of the 20th century, but he's sort of diminished. But I think overall, he was more of an elitist than any kind of a racist. There was like two kind of people in the world. You were like as smart as he was, and everyone else is sort of the unwashed masses. I think that's the last of the. Dom,
Okay, we included this very peculiar building. This is actually, in our book, it's located on the section about the harbor, which of course the harbor is many things nowadays. So we kind of do a harbor tour and relate to the old to the new. This building is interesting in a lot of ways. We call it the power plant. Back when it was a power plant, there was no big sign on it that said power plant. You've probably noticed this, Now there's an old broom factory. It used to be a broom factory. Now it's an office and complex and art studios, and it says the broom factory on the outside. This is what we do in Baltimore. Just hollow out the building and tell everybody what it used to be. But anyway, here's the power plant. Interesting, partly because it was one of the purported 11 buildings that survived the Great Baltimore Fire of 1904. Which the fire that gutted downtown and actually gutted a lot of the buildings that are said to have survived. They survived because their structures were intact, but a lot of them, like the building that's now the Chesapeake Shakespeare Theater, was actually burned out, but the building survived. So when they say 11 buildings survived, well, not quite. This building, however, was almost entirely built of brick and steel, and it was right next to the water. That probably helped. It survived. In fact, they started building this in 1904, and they didn't finish until 1909. So they basically kept building it before and after the fire. And for a long, long time, it was the power plant for the city's electric railways. I'm not sure of the year. I'm sorry, I'm down on that factoid. I'm not sure of the year when it was sold to Consolidated Gas and Electric Company, which was the big electric utility, direct ancestor of today's BGE. And Consolidated Gas and Electric Company used it to generate steam. They used that big boiler in there to generate steam for steam heat customers. Now, there are still a lot of companies, buildings downtown that use steam heat. That's why you see clouds coming out of the streets, on a few select streets downtown. They moved the steam operation in the 70s. BGE basically scrapped this building and moved their steam operations, I think, somewhere near the block, I believe is where that is. It's probably gas fired. Anyway, this thing, I should go to the next slide. This is what it used to be, a big smoke belching and yet ornate mess on the edge of the harbor, right over the inner harbor, all this, many, many smokestacks. And the coal would come up in barges. They'd load it directly into the building and probably take it up on an elevator to dump down into the furnaces. I don't know what, I've never seen a diagram of what was going on inside. But the other thing I love about this building now, as weird as it is an example of adaptive reuse par excellence. Essentially, the city of Baltimore said, we don't really want to tear it down. They tore everything else around the harbor, all the wharves, all the old fish barns, et cetera. But they left this building and they said, let's see if somebody comes up with a good idea for it. And David Cornish and company, Cordish and company, who specialize in like festival architecture and stuff, proposed, let's hollow it out and turn it into entertainment and restaurant space and offices. And Cordish and company still have their offices here in the power plant. And here you can see the lamented Barnes and Noble bookstore, where they just basically, in that space, the bases of those big smokestacks essentially are decor. They've gone from being actually the raison d'etre of the whole thing to being decor. But it's a fascinating piece of adaptive reuse, and still has some reuse left in it, we think. I'm not sure the status of this space right now. It was a bookstore for 13 years or something like that. Brennan, ta-da.
All right, well, I'm talking about, of course, this is the city's most beautiful skyscraper. I'm not talking about what they call the finger building on the right there, the modern building. I mean, apologies to those who like that sort of a modern architecture, but the building in the middle with the mansard roof with the gold, the gilt detailing, that's the 34-story tall. I refer to it as the Baltimore Trust Tower because that's the bank that erected it in 1929. Of course, now you know the rest of the story. 1929, not a good time to open a big bank building. It'd be like, hey, I think I'll go into the mortgage business in 2008. So Baltimore Trust built this beautiful building, the Baltimore Trust building. A bank went out of business rapidly. The building was kind of a white elephant and largely vacant through the Depression. I think in World War II, it started to fill up with the alphabet soup of military and government operations. But it's a good building to talk about the rise and fall and possible, we'll see, a reemergence of downtown Baltimore. I think it is sort of like Art Deco meets Gothic, but then this detail on the roof kind of looks Mayan to me. Some of those that look like gargoyles, I could see them somewhere in a Mesoamerican temple. It's just a strange, eclectic mix of architecture, this sort of stuff that typified that era. Now, some of the detailing tells a story on it itself. Now, this giant here with a building it's in the flames that he seems to be crying or blowing on, that's a nod to the 1904 fire. And he seems to be clutching another bank building. Apparently, there was a bank building on the site that survived the fire. Tom mentioned the great 1904 fire. It in hindsight, it kind of did a service to downtown Baltimore because it cleared out a lot of dead wood and allowed them to modernize the infrastructure and set the city up for beginning into the 20th century. And it did pretty well. But curiously, about in the 1950, when the city was having its highest population, is when nothing much was happening downtown. So that's when the Charles Center plan was hatched in 1954, where they tried to straighten up some of the old school streets that hadn't been burned in the fire and create these plazas. And that's when we start to see the architecture like this sort of mid-century stuff come into play. And it did a pretty good job keeping the city's downtown market thriving. But what really got downtown Baltimore, in a lot of ways the city, was more and more we're becoming a branch office town. This is what used to be on the roof of the building. It was the Maryland National Bank, and those letters used to change color to tell you what the weather was going to be the next day. That bank got swallowed up. Next thing you know, it's Bank of America. They've gone off to Charlotte, and another big building doesn't have a use anymore. Well, of course, today, ta-da! Yes, it's now an apartment building. I haven't been up in it yet, but it'd be cool to have a friend that lived there as I go in that pool. I understand the penthouse is something like $12,000 a month. I don't know who they think is going to afford that, but these type buildings that initially were the least popular for office space are now the most popular for being readapted for residences. And we're going to probably see more and more of that because now people are working remotely post-COVID, or hopefully post-COVID. There's even more pressure to convert these. This is the interior. I'm not thrilled about this because you can see there's a beautiful interior banking space and there's a mosaic floor. I guess we can say it's now hidden beneath that mat that's part of the gym and it's protecting it, but I would like to see it somehow used so we can once again go in and see that the beautiful floor, which has murals. I believe it tells history of Maryland. Tom, are you?
Yeah, I'm up. Okay, most of the audience probably knows this building, and I'm going to make short shrift of it. But 1939, the year of Gone with the Wind, the year of Wizard of Oz. So a big year for movies, and very much in the era of big, glorious movie palaces. This is the only remnant we have in Baltimore of the old, colorful movie palaces, certainly the only remnant that is still a movie house. And in its time, originally, it was just a neighborhood movie house, not particularly spectacular, but it's in this, what they called streamlined moderne. The architect, John Zink, was a specialist in this look with the glass brick and neon lighting. It's still really nice look. And if you haven't been to the Senator in years, it's really, they get good movies there. And they got some really nice lighting design done in there. They've rehabbed, so you can now go to one of, they've got the bunkers on the side, the small theaters. And the lobby here with the restored murals representing the history of visual communication. And last but not least, the most fabulous sidewalk in the city and the one with the best traction. Now, Kristina, if you would indulge me, this is normally the end of our program, I believe, but I just want to flash one more chapter in our book is about the parks. I just want to say a word about George Frederick, architect of this beautiful building, architect of City Hall, architect of the Silburn Mansion. And what a cool place to take a date if you're dating somebody or grandchildren. And one of the best, this is a bad slide, but one of the most beautiful conflations of natural and architectural design I can think of in Baltimore. All right. And I think it's up to me to stop the share.
Yes.
So there's our book.
Thank you guys so much. And I want to add, I could have said this at the beginning, but I think it works now too, that this is, a history lover's guide to Baltimore. And there's a little bit of, we got some tour guide-ness to it, but it's really, as much as it is for people coming and visitors to town, it is for people who live here too. Lots of great stories about places that you've probably seen or heard of, but lots of places that even if you've lived here a while, you may never have been or may never have even come across in the city. And I think, again, hopefully as we're getting out into visiting places and going places again, we can make some of these history spots on our list. And we had just a couple of comments that I wanted to add, which is one is that Anthony is joining us, and he is the university architect for UMB, and says that visitors are welcome to come to Davidge Hall. And some of you may know, somebody mentioned the Immigration Museum when we were talking about immigration to Baltimore, and that's where BCHS, the Baltimore City Historical Society, has just moved, and they have tours on the weekends and by appointment. Somebody else wants to say, we were talking about Zion, that they are having their sour beef dinner this weekend. So Google Zion sour beef dinner if you want to go experience this authentic German dinner in the heart of Baltimore. Oh, and Nathan wants to add that the Baltimore National Heritage Area is at the Mencken House as well. And so if anybody else has any questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A. Oh, and Heather wants to mention that the Senator has cocktails at their bar, and you can bring food from Clark Burger. So it's a very good place. Dune is showing there this weekend if anybody's a sci-fi fan. But yeah, so you can put them in the Q&A or in the chat or raise your hand. I wanted to ask you guys, since we're kind of indoors open in the architecture world, is it, you talk about some of the success stories in the book of places that may have easily been torn down. And if you guys could just, talk about what you think are some of the real success stories of places that you were able to include in this because they didn't get torn down or have been kind of rehabilitated.
Well, certainly the American Brewery, which I mentioned, that was, I wrote about that I used to work for the Chronicle of Philanthropy, and I wrote about that, how it was a pretty bold move for a charity that was careful, safely ensconced in leafy Howard County to put the money where the mouth is and actually go into these communities, the hardscrabble East Baltimore community, and put the money in because a lot of the folks that they serve, and that's just, a phenomenal example. I wish somebody would do something with the Old Town Mall. That's been rotting since I wrote about that 20 years ago. As an example of something, it's going to be, every time I go by, they've nibbled away at it more, and I'm just waiting for a fire to finish it off. Tom, you got some other success stories?
Well, I think the Parkway Theater is a great example. Here was a building which was originally built as a movie theater back, I think it might even have been when it was silence. I'm not sure. It's a really old original theater there. And it went through all these changes, became retail space, became a movie theater again, all these changes. And eventually it was almost a ruin. And some people got inside, film buffs. I think it was folks from the Baltimore Film Festival, got inside and said, my God, there's this beautiful theater space, big rounded room. Nothing's straight in the whole space. It's a big womb-like space, but all around it was decay. And they hired Ziegler, Hoops and Sneed, or maybe it was just Steve Ziegler, to come. And what they did with this building was not try to restore it to its original glamour, but to do a stabilization showing the mark of age upon it. And it's been basically, it's adaptive reuse as a movie theater. It's been reused it went from theater to ruin to movie theater again. And it's just a cool space for, particularly the auditorium is a fantastic Baltimore interior. The great interiors of Baltimore, I'd say, are the Peabody Library, the Palm House in Druid Hill Park, and the B&O Railroad Museum. But up in that category, I think there's some other ecclesiastical interiors, yes. But
Hippodrome was certainly
yeah, that's quite a space.
That was vacant for a long time. I remember that.
Success story.
So there.
Michael wants to add that another good example is the Patterson Theater in Highlandtown. That's now the Creative Alliance. And Anthony also adds that UMB renovated St. Peter's School in Poppleton into the new Community Engagement Center. So see some good community, creating these old buildings for community. I've got more questions if we don't have any other questions.
Clifton Mansion. Tom, I'm surprised you didn't know that. That's been a bright mark of restoration ongoing.
Yeah, for considering that 30 years ago, when I moved to Baltimore, it was still the headquarters of the Baltimore Golf Club.
Oh yeah, I remember.
It had lockers and all these people walking around in sneakers, and it's a mansion that has an astonishing amount of history, and it is now being room by room, stairway by stairway restored inside to something like its original glamour. And they've done this phenomenal work looking under the surface and finding what color paint there was and discovering, chipping away and finding murals hidden and so forth. It's really astonishing. And now people go and get married there all the dang time, giving the Peabody some competition.
Yeah. What was your favorite, what's either your favorite historic spot in Baltimore, and if that's not in the book, what's your favorite one that's in the book? You could go either way. Oh,
I would go with, for me, it's the Krug Ironworks. I don't know why. There's something just amazing about going into this business. It's been there. It's been an iron shop there since 1814. And they produced a lot of the stuff that we admire in downtown Baltimore, this wrought iron work on downtown, down Park Avenue, Saratoga Street, beautiful hand wrought iron. And up in the Tony neighborhoods like Guilford and Roland Park, you see a lot of it too. And these people have just been making it the old way for all this time. And the building itself is really old. And you go up the steps, the place is built out of planks so thick, you just don't see pieces of wood this thick in buildings anymore. So it's a real whiff of another time.
And Ilka adds that if you contact them, you can you can get a behind kind of a tour. They're not necessarily open regularly for tours, but they are happy to give people tours.
I think they've always required you have to have 10 or more people or something like that. They don't want to just shut down for every 2 or 3, but if you pull together a crowd.
Yeah.
Be right back.
Also, well, this is so Brennan just had to step away for a second, but to talk about and Nathan says that there has been an open doors to the ironworks. Catherine is wondering about the process of selection of who made it into the book, who didn't, and then the collaboration between you two.
Did we collaborate?
Well, we certainly
did make a book together, so I think that qualifies as collaboration.
We started meeting in person at a coffee shop, and then of course we couldn't do that anymore.
Going to a beer place instead.
Well, I mean, this is a series of books that the publisher has for other cities, and they sent me a couple of examples. Basically, you have to have everything in there that you can actually go and see. So the big things, I mean, and even things like I have the Children's Museum downtown. Well, it used to be the old fish market, so I have to mention that. The hardest part was kind of organizing, and how do you organize 300 years of history in a way that a tourist can find useful? The Detroit book I saw, they chopped it up by geography. So if you're in the west side of Detroit, here's all the cool stuff to see. That might be handier in a town like Detroit, which is so much bigger than Baltimore in terms of square miles, but it doesn't really tell a narrative when you're just running into things. So we tried to organize it in such a way that we tell the overall story and group things together. And you have to, we wrote right in the beginning, if you really make our day, read the whole book and then come to the city, but unlikely that's going to happen.
Basically took lists. We just divvied up a list of who would write about what. And generally, Brennan and I both worked on the Charmed Life column in the city paper for however 6 years that ran. So each of us already, there was a lot of material we wrote about in that column, but then, this one would be Brennan's again, because he already had that base of knowledge, and we could use our own old columns as reference material, which is handy. We did this in the year of COVID, though, so unfortunately, I feel guilty to this day about how much research I did using the dreaded internet. But building upon back knowledge, building upon going and taking looks from the sidewalk, and having a good library of Baltimore history material, I think it worked out. Brennan, it was his baby, and I really appreciate that he realized it was too much for one man alone, and he had to call me up and get some backup, because it was an enormous pleasure. I just love writing about this stuff. I like writing, which I haven't done enough of lately anyway.
Kristina, you mentioned a favorite thing that was not in the book, and I have this sitting on my shelf. This is from the Marble Bar, the basement of the Congress Hotel, where the famous Marble Bar was. I knew it as, when it was the punk club. I pulled this out of a dumpster. This actually would have been mounted like this. It goes on the ceiling. You can see the black paint would have been the Marble Bar years. And there's it's not in the book, but there's a lot of history on that little corner. We probably, I don't know, in hindsight, maybe I should have included that in the music section, but.
I felt bad about not including the Montebello water treatment plant, because it has some great buildings, and it's really essentially, in terms of the public, it's all about public health. People jog around the lake, and the big plants, they filter the water. And it would have given me a chance to talk about Abel Woolman, who was the great inventor of modern sanitary water systems, and a Hopkins guy, and a visionary, and probably saved as many lives as anybody could. He's guy contributed to worldwide human benefit. So there's Abel Woolman for you.
I think this speaks to the fact that there's a lot that couldn't go into the book, and that's why we're so lucky to have Doors Open Baltimore every year, so that we can get these behind the scenes tours of places that aren't open to the public maybe yet. Maybe they're working on it, or maybe they're really never open to the public, but we get that kind of special treat with Doors Open to get those. It's 6 o'clock, so I think that's the end of our time slot here. Thank you again so much to Brennan and Tom for talking and sharing. Again, History Lovers Guide to Baltimore. It's available at your bookstores. You can also order it, I think, directly from the History Press. And Brennan and Tom, did you want to talk about, I think you had a couple of events coming up where you'll be doing book signings in case people want to get a copy from you?
The only thing I know, I think December 10th, I'm going to be at Union Brewing. I mean, I'm there all the time anyway, but they're having a holiday market. And I'm hopefully going to do something at Whitehall Mill, kind of a signing, but I don't have that penciled in yet. But hopefully we'll have more things around the holidays, because that's, when we're hoping people will be looking for something to.
People can if you know me or Brennan, or you're pretty good at looking people up, you can certainly send me an email and say, I want to get your book. And if you're in Baltimore, I do a delivery route. When I have the books, I drive around and say, well, I can do this one and this one. I hand delivered them. It was worth it to me. So I've got a half a dozen left, which I'm hawking. So go ahead and email tomchocoly@gmail.com if you can figure out how to spell it. Fully.
Yeah, I guess it's on the book, so if they don't have the book, it's
right.
on the book.
No punctuation.
Yeah. Great. Thank you guys so much. Thank you for everybody who joined from all over Baltimore and the world. We really enjoyed having you guys here and adding your little history commentaries.
Cool.
Thank you for doing this.
Thanks.